In the dust-worn volumes of Lancaster County Courthouse records, a grim pattern emerges. 4 separate deaths recorded between the years 1837 and 1841, each steeped in quiet tragedy, yet bound by an unspoken terror. There was the attorney who plunged from his horse one fog-thick morning, his body found broken in the cold light before dawn. There was the banker, discovered lifeless in the shallow, whispering waters of Mill Creek, the cause of death marked simply as drowning. There was the circuit judge who, in the heart of harvest season, fell to a sudden illness so swift it left no time for warning. And there was the county sheriff, found lifeless at the bottom of his own well, his face locked in an expression that would haunt the witnesses for years. What the ledger of these deaths conceals, what the ink on those pages cannot confess, is that all 4 men were bound by marriage to sisters of the same Irish Catholic lineage, and that each man met his end within 18 months of his wedding day. They were the Brennan sisters, Bridget, Catherine, Margaret and Sarah, heirs to Lancaster County's largest and most prized farm, and they would do whatever it took to keep it intact. Before this chronicle unfolds further, before the story of the Brennan family farm and the 4 widows who refused separation can be fully told, we must return to the summer of 1836, the moment everything changed for them, when candlelight illuminated a conversation that would seal the fate of 4 prominent men. The Brennan family farm sprawled over 847 acres of Pennsylvania's richest soil, hemmed in by the steady sweep of Mill Creek to the north and the well-traveled Lancaster Pike to the south. Patrick Brennan, a man who arrived from County Cork with nothing but iron will and a fierce hatred for English landlords, had spent 37 years forging his American dynasty. By the year 183-6, his domain rivaled entire towns in value, a grand stone house that could have stood among the finest in Philadelphia, barns vast enough to shelter 200 head of cattle, and grain silos capable of sustaining half the county through the cruelest winters. But when Patrick Brennan died that October, he left behind a problem that would have shattered lesser bloodlines. Pennsylvania's inheritance laws decreed that a man's property be divided equally among his children upon his death. Patrick had no sons. His 4 daughters, Bridget, 28, Catherine, 26, Margaret, 24, and Sarah, 21, faced the horrifying prospect of watching their father's lifetime of toil and triumph carved into worthless fragments, sold away to satisfy the insatiable demands of creditors and tax collectors. They had been raised to understand this day would come. Patrick Brennan had drilled into them the sacred duty of land stewardship, weaving into their childhood the stories of their grandfather's eviction from Irish soil, of families torn apart when property passed to strangers. "Land is not just dirt and stones," he would intone, his thick brogue still present after decades in America. "Land is your blood, your future, your very soul. Lose the land, and you lose everything that makes you who you are." Lancaster County in 1836 was a land where such truths were etched into the lives of its people. German and Irish farmers knew that property was not mere possession. It was survival, identity, legacy. But knowing this and preserving it were 2 separate battles entirely. The Brennan sisters were no ordinary women of the soil. Bridget, the eldest, concealed a razor-sharp mind behind demure smiles and downcast glances. She could compute compound interest faster than any banker and had, in secret, managed the farm's ledgers since her father's eyesight began to fail, Cathy's. Erin had inherited her father's uncanny gift of reading people, discerning their weaknesses, their desires, with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Margaret possessed an otherworldly beauty that made men forget themselves, cloaked beneath which was a ruthless pragmatism few ever guessed. Sarah, the youngest, carried a voice that could lure birds from trees and a talent for donning whatever mask the moment demanded. Together they became a quiet, calculating conspiracy, one that would echo through Lancaster County history. Yet the true shape of that conspiracy would remain hidden for nearly a century. It first took form during the long, hushed nights after their father's funeral, when the sisters gathered in their kitchen under lamplight to confront the abyss of their future. Property taxes alone threatened to consume every penny of their inheritance within 2 years. Marriage, the only conventional recourse for women without property, would scatter them, bind them to strangers, erase their names, and fracture their unity. But they dared to imagine another way. What if marriage itself could be the instrument of their survival rather than its undoing? They would stay together. It was on a cold November evening, when frost had etched its crystalline fingers across the windows, and the fire within the Brennan stonehouse cast long, trembling shadows upon the walls, that Bridget Brennan spoke words that would bind them all to a destiny darker than any could foresee. Her voice, low yet unwavering, broke the hush of that winter night. Whatever it takes, we stay together, and we keep the farm whole. Margaret, ever grounded in practicality, met her sister's declaration with measured resistance. "The law says differently," she reminded her, her tone both factual and warning. But Catherine, her voice deliberate and slow, replied with a chilling certainty, "The law can be influenced." And then it was Sarah, the youngest, whose words fell like a cold benediction, sealing the sisters' unspoken covenant. "Men die, sisters. Husbands die, and widows inherit everything." The first death would follow sooner than any might have anticipated. On March 15, 1838, scarcely 14 months after Patrick Brennan's funeral, and only 6 months after Bridget's wedding, Thomas Hennessy was gone. Hennessy, the most prominent attorney in Lancaster County, had been a logical choice for the eldest Brennan sister. A man in his early 40s, a widower for 3 years, without children, and with wealth enough to cover the Brennan estate's mounting taxes without hesitation. His influence in Lancaster was considerable, his legal acumen respected, and he promised the kind of stability that could preserve the Brennan inheritance. Their courtship had been swift and intense. Hennessy, whose first wife had been claimed by consumption, found himself entranced by Bridget's rare combination of beauty and intellect. She could debate legal precedent with the same ease she brought to orchestrating elaborate dinners. She laughed warmly at his tales of courtroom triumphs and listened with intent to his dreams of a future as county judge. Within 2 months of their meeting at Sunday Mass, Thomas Hennessy was certain. Bridget Brennan was the answer to prayers he had never spoken aloud. Their marriage in December 1837 was a spectacle, a grand affair proclaiming to all of Lancaster County that the Brennan fortunes were secure. Hennessy took up residence in the stone farmhouse, bringing not just wealth but the legal knowledge to reshape the family's holdings. A complex but lawful arrangement emerged, a family trust designed to preserve the land intact while securing each sister's future. But Thomas Hennessy had underestimated the depths of Bridget's resolve. Weeks into their union, a pattern began to emerge that unsettled him. Bridget's attentions were not given to him alone. They were devoted to her sisters. She insisted Catherine, Margaret and Sarah remain within the household, transforming what should have been their honeymoon into a continuous family convergence. When Hennessy ventured that newlyweds might need privacy, her reply was abrupt and cold. "My sisters are my blood, Thomas. They stay." Tension deepened when Hennessy uncovered Bridget's secret inquiries into the finances of several eligible bachelors in Lancaster County. When pressed, she claimed only concern for her sister's welfare, but Hennessy sensed a calculation that went far beyond concern. The morning of March 15th began with discord. Hennessy had received an offer to acquire a law practice in Philadelphia, a venture that would elevate his career but demand leaving Lancaster County. He proposed it over breakfast. Bridget's reaction was immediate and unyielding. "We're not leaving," she said, without lifting her gaze from her porridge. "This is our future, Bridget, a chance to build something bigger than a country law practice. Our future is here, this land, this farm, my sisters. Your sisters can visit us in Philadelphia. They can even come live with us once they're married." Bridget finally looked up, her eyes reflecting a fire that would not be quelled. She fixed her gaze upon him that morning with a look that would haunt Thomas Hennessy long after the fog had lifted. Later, he confided to his law clerk that her expression had unsettled him in a way he could not easily shake. "You don't understand, do you, Thomas?" she said, her voice low, deliberate. "We don't leave. We don't separate. Ever." Outside the stone walls of the Brennan farmhouse, the argument unfolded as Hennessy prepared to mount his horse for the ride into Lancaster town. The morning was dense with fog, an unnatural haze for mid-March, though Pennsylvania's spring often gave way to strange weather. Neighbors later testified to hearing raised voices emanating from the Brennan household, though the mist swallowed every word, leaving only the sound of tension. By 9:30 a.m., the F.E.'s tranquility was broken. Thomas Hennessy did not return. His horse, alone, came back to the farmhouse, trembling, sweating, its eyes wide with something that resembled terror. Bridget Brennan's response was swift and decisive. Without hesitation, she called for a search party, her grief seeming profound, immediate, and convincing. 3 hours later, the searchers found him. Sprawled beside the main road just half a mile from the farmhouse, his neck was broken, the result, the coroner later declared, of a catastrophic fall from horseback. Dr. James Mallister, the county coroner, conducted a meticulous examination. His report was clinical yet troubling. Injuries consistent with a fall, a broken neck, contusions on the skull, and bruising indicating that the horse had stepped upon him after he had been thrown. The fog, he noted, would have made the familiar road perilous. And yet, to those who knew Hennessy best, there were troubling anomalies. He was a seasoned horseman, one who had ridden that exact route countless times in all weather. More troubling still was the condition of his mare when she returned, agitated to a degree that exceeded what might be expected from a simple accident. And then there was Bridget's reaction. Her sorrow seemed genuine, performed with the precision of one who understood the part she was expected to play. But her first actions were not of mourning alone. Her immediate attention turned to practicalities, securing Hennessy's will, consolidating his assets, ensuring the legal structures protecting the farm remained unshaken. It was a grief measured, purposeful, and unnerving. The funeral drew hundreds, a testament to Hennessy's standing in Lancaster's legal circles, his sudden death reverberating through the county. Bridget assumed her role with solemn dignity, accepting condolences with the grace of a practiced widow. Yet those closest to the family noted something unspoken among the sisters. Their expressions did not speak of sorrow alone. They spoke of accomplishment, of an unvoiced pact achieved. Within a month, Catherine Brennan began accepting invitations from Hamilton Crawford, Lancaster County's most successful banker. This courtship would inaugurate a pattern that would come to define the Brennan sisters' marriages, a disturbing consistency that would not escape the notice of those attuned to their affairs. Hamilton Crawford was a man of calculated resolve, a Scotsman in his late 30s who had converted to Catholicism to wed his first wife, now dead 3 years, claimed by childbed fever. His bank held mortgages on half the farms in Lancaster County, his personal fortune rivaling the merchant princes of Philadelphia. Catherine approached him with a mix of vulnerability and determination that proved irresistible to a man who had buried himself for years in ledger books and loan agreements. She came to his bank on Tuesday afternoons, ostensibly to discuss the family's affairs in the wake of Thomas Hennessy's death. But the conversations shifted gradually and subtly from business to matters of a more personal nature. "I worry about my sisters," Catherine confessed one afternoon, her voice carrying a note of practiced concern. "Bridget is still mourning, of course, but Margaret and Sarah, they need guidance, protection. A woman alone in this world faces dangers no man can predict." Crawford, with no siblings of his own. Hamilton Crawford, a man who had never known the depth of family loyalty, found himself drawn into its strange gravity by Catherine Brennan's devotion. A devotion unlike any he had encountered before, a commitment to her sisters so absolute it seemed to eclipse all other ties. To Crawford, who had no siblings and whose life had been shaped by ledgers, contracts, and solitary years in the quiet corridors of banking halls, her allegiance was a revelation. Catherine embodied something he had never dared to define. the conviction that blood bound more tightly than any vow or law. Their engagement, announced in August of 1838, carried no shock for those who had watched Crawford's transformation from grieving widower to enchanted suitor. By October, exactly 1 year after Patrick Brennan's death and 7 months after Thomas Hennessy's funeral, Crawford stood at Catherine's side before the altar. The wedding was not merely a union of two people, it was the joining of ambition, devotion, and something far more dangerous. Crawford moved into the Brennan farmhouse, bringing with him not only his vast wealth, but a mastery of financial strategy. Like Hennessy before him, he restructured the property arrangements so as to safeguard the inheritance of all 4 sisters. Catherine's insistence that they remain together went unchallenged, sealed by a trust that bound their fates in law. But Hamilton Crawford was a different man than Thomas Hennessy. Where the lawyer had been swept along by circumstance, Crawford was deliberate, methodical. His banker's mind noticed patterns, threads invisible to a casual observer. Within weeks of the marriage, he began to keep a private journal, a chronicle that would, in hindsight, stand as a record of forewarning. November the 3rd, 1838. Catherine insists on maintaining separate accounts for each sister's inheritance from father, claims it is temporary until they all marry. Margaret shows no interest in suitors, despite her obvious beauty. Sarah actively discourages the attentions of men who call. I begin to suspect no intention of marriage exists among them. November 18th, 1838. Bridget visited the bank today to discuss investment opportunities. Her knowledge of compound interest and property values exceeds that of most businessmen. Asked pointed questions about inheritance laws, particularly widows' rights in cases of interstate death, claimed academic curios. Yet her tone felt deliberate, measured. December the 1st, 1838. Overheard a conversation between Catherine and Margaret about maintaining unity and protecting the legacy. When they noticed my presence, they abruptly changed the subject to Christmas preparations. I grow convinced they have formed some sort of pact regarding property. December 15th, 1838. Catherine has become distant, mechanical in her affections, shows greater interest in business than in our marriage. When I broached the possibility of starting a family, her response was cold, almost hostile. "The 4 of us are family enough," she said. Crawford's suspicions deepened when he learned Margaret was receiving regular visitors, notably Judge Cornelius Whitman, the circuit judge presiding over Lancaster County's most consequential legal cases. Whitman, a man of distinction in his 50s, a widower with grown children in Philadelphia, would hold influence over any legal challenge to the Brennan family's property. Crawford's instincts as a banker recognized a pattern, one of quiet convergence, a network of intentions woven by the sisters. It troubled him deeply, but Crawford made a fatal error. He believed that awareness of the conspiracy would shield him from its reach. The second death came on February 8, 1839, in a winter so brutal it entered Lancaster County's memory as one of the coldest on record. Crawford had begun a habit of walking the farm's boundaries each morning, partly for exercise, partly to inspect the Brennan estate's winter preparations. Mill Creek, which marked the northern edge of their property, had frozen solid for the first time in decades, presenting what seemed an unbroken path across the ice. Yet the ice betrayed him. Crawford's body was later discovered by a neighbor searching for stray cattle. The banker had evidently attempted to cross the frozen creek. The ice gave way beneath his weight, plunging him into the merciless depths. The frozen surface of Mill Creek betrayed Hamilton Crawford that bitter February morning. He had stepped onto what appeared an unbroken sheet of ice, only for it to shatter beneath him. The banker plunged into the frigid abyss below, swallowed instantly by a torrent of water whose cold clawed at his breath and strength. The current dragged him mercilessly, carrying his body nearly a quarter-mile downstream before it lodged him against a fallen log, a grim anchor to a fate sealed. Death by drowning, compounded by the merciless embrace of winter, seemed the inevitable verdict for such an accident. And yet, Crawford had left behind something far more unsettling than a body. Hidden away in his private safe at the bank was his journal, a ledger of suspicion written in his own hand. The final entry, dated the day before his death, trembled with foreboding. "Catherine knows I suspect something. Her behavior has become increasingly erratic. She insists on accompanying me everywhere, claims she worries about my safety, but her concern feels more like surveillance. Have decided to confront her tomorrow about my suspicions regarding Thomas Hennessy's death. If something happens to me, look to the sisters. They are not what they seem. Dr. James Mallister, who had examined Thomas Hennessy's body the year before, found Crawford's death equally straightforward from a medical perspective. Drowning in icy waters was no uncommon hazard in rural Pennsylvania winters. The ice on Mill Creek, while appearing solid, concealed treacherous weakness, an underground spring below that created hidden thin spots, invisible to even the most cautious traveler. Crawford's body bore no signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no indication that this was anything other than tragedy. Yet the words in his journal lingered like a whisper of warning. Catherine's grief was outwardly as genuine as Bridget's had been, but those who observed her closely noted a troubling consistency. Both widows seemed far more intent on the practicalities of inheritance than succumbing to pure mourning. Within days of Crawford's funeral, they were convening with lawyers, consulting bank officials, safeguarding the family's financial future. To any willing to see, the pattern was emerging, unmistakable, yet in a community where the sanctity of marriage and the sorrow of widowhood were beyond reproach, few dared to speak these suspicions aloud. 6 weeks after Crawford's funeral, Margaret Brennan announced her engagement to Judge Cornelius Whitman, a man whose very name commanded deference throughout Lancaster County and beyond. Whitman represented the pinnacle of Pennsylvania's legal and social hierarchy. At 53, he presided over Lancaster's most consequential cases, his judgments shaping thousands of lives. His station had long been considered a gateway to higher judicial authority, perhaps even the state Supreme Court. Margaret's pursuit of him was not impulsive, it was an artful strategy, one that eclipsed the more direct advances of her sisters. Where Catherine had wielded vulnerability and Bridget intellect, Margaret deployed calculated delicacy, a campaign of strategic vulnerability. She first appeared in Whitman's courtroom in March of 1839, ostensibly seeking counsel on matters of property law tied to her father's estate. Her beauty drew the eye, but it was her apparent innocence, a studied uncertainty about legal intricacies, that commanded his attention. Beneath that facade lay a mind far sharper than she allowed to show. She seemed the embodiment of a sheltered flower, naive yet knowing. "I'm afraid I don't understand these inheritance complications, Your Honor," she told him in their first private conversation, her blue eyes wide with seeming bewilderment. "My sisters and I simply wish to honor our father's wishes, but the law appears designed to destroy families rather than protect them." For Whitman, a man seasoned by decades of contested wills and grasping kin, Margaret's devotion to her family was striking. Here was a young woman who placed blood ties above all else, a woman who sought the law's counsel not for personal gain, but to preserve something far older, far deeper, the legacy of her blood. Their conversations, at first constrained to questions of law and property, soon unfurled into something far more intimate, drifting toward literature, philosophy, and the judge's own reflections on loss. For Judge Cornelius Whitman, whose wife had been claimed by death 5 years earlier, and whose children had scattered to distant cities, leaving him to solitude, these exchanges carried an unspoken weight. Margaret Brennan did not press her advantage. She never sought private meetings, never declared romantic intent, never appeared anything other than a grateful young woman seeking the counsel of a distinguished elder. Yet beneath her careful demeanor lay a strategy both deliberate and patient. Whitman found himself anticipating her visits, arranging his days to ensure her presence, and gradually revealing a side of himself that had long been hidden, the man in search of solace. She listened with quiet attentiveness, offering sympathy without intrusion, and seemed to understand his loneliness without attempting to exploit it. When their engagement was announced in May of 1839, Lancaster County society stirred with whispers. The union of Judge Whitman, a man whose reputation for integrity was without blemish, to the third Brennan sister, in the wake of the convenient deaths of her sister's husbands, appeared to many as either a remarkable coincidence or a matter steeped in suspicion. Yet to Whitman, Margaret was a revelation. For the first time in years, he seemed genuinely content. She brought warmth into his austere life, infusing his home with laughter, curiosity, and a kind of light he had not known for years. Her interest in his work was genuine, her questions about legal precedent precise and thoughtful, her memory of cases and colleagues astonishing. More disquieting still, she shared his growing concern over the pattern of deaths surrounding her family. "I worry about my sisters," Margaret confessed to Whitman 2 weeks before their wedding, her voice quiet but edged with something unreadable. "Bridget and Catherine have been different since their husbands died, more secretive, more intense about keeping the family together. Sometimes I feel like they are planning something, but I cannot imagine what." These words, spoken in confidence, would later be recalled with unease, remembered either as Margaret's warning or as her most subtle deception, a calculated move to distance herself from her sister's conspiracy while positioning herself as its innocent victim. Their wedding in July of 1839 was a quieter affair than the others. Out of respect for the recent losses and in deference to the murmurs now swirling around the Brennan family, whispers of unusual fortune and suspicious deaths, it was deliberately restrained. Whitman moved into the farmhouse, as his predecessors had, though he retained his own residence in Lancaster for professional purposes. The arrangement meant he spent weekdays at the farm and returned to the town for court sessions, a rhythm that placed him in daily contact with the sisters. The judge's legal mind made him a more discerning observer than either Hennessy or Crawford. Within a month of his marriage, he began to record in private notes a pattern of behavior that chilled him. Details that his predecessors had missed or dismissed. Those notes, discovered years later, painted a portrait of a man increasingly convinced he had entered a calculated conspiracy. August 10th, 1839. Margaret insists on knowing my schedule in advance, claims it is for planning meals and social gatherings, but her questions seem directed more toward my solitary travels than domestic concerns. August 25th, 1839. Overheard Bridget and Catherine speaking of the final arrangement and completing the plan. Upon my entering the room, they abruptly changed the subject. Margaret's reaction struck me, not curiosity, but fear. September 2nd, 1839. Margaret examined my will and insurance documents with unusual intensity. She claimed it was to understand legal terminology, yet her inquiries revealed a sophistication that suggested she knew far more of the law than she let on. It was the work of someone quietly preparing, someone who understood that knowledge was a weapon, and that the weapon in question was aimed at something far larger than herself. September 15th, 1839. Judge Cornelius Whitman, driven by a growing unease that had taken root in the months since his marriage, resolved to confront Margaret Brennan directly about the suspicions that had haunted him. His voice, tempered by decades of judicial authority, carried both accusation and gravity. Margaret's reaction was immediate, tears welling, protests of innocence spilling in rushed whispers. But beneath her grief lay something calculated, rehearsed. Was she a victim ensnared by her sister's dark design, or a masterful actress concealing complicity? Whitman's station afforded him access to truths his predecessors had lacked. Quietly, methodically, he began his own investigation into the deaths of Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford. He obtained coroner reports, interviewed witnesses, and pored over every detail. What he uncovered chilled him to the bone. Both men had died in moments of discord with their wives, disputes over leaving Lancaster County that had not gone unnoticed. Both deaths, while recorded as accidents, bore the marks of precise timing and opportunity. More unsettling still, both men had recently altered their wills to lavish their fortunes upon their wives, and thus upon the Brennan family. But Whitman's inquiries unearthed an even darker truth. He was not alone in questioning the Brennan sisters. Across Lancaster County, a shadow moved. A private investigator by the name of Daniel Murphy was quietly making inquiries of his own, claiming to represent unnamed parties troubled by the pattern of deaths. Murphy's questions probed deeply: the sisters' financial arrangements, their alliances with influential men, and even their future plans for marriage. When Whitman sought him out, he found Murphy had vanished from Lancaster, leaving only fragments of his work. witness statements, copies of public records, and a trail that suggested someone was assembling a puzzle no one yet dared name. On October 30th, 1839, Whitman made the decision that would seal his fate. Alone with Margaret in the farmhouse parlor on a night soaked in relentless rain, he confronted her. Catherine and Sarah were away in Lancaster town for supplies, and for the first time in weeks, the newlyweds were left in isolation. Whitman had chosen the moment with care, knowing Margaret's demeanor shifted markedly in the absence of her sisters. "Margaret," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of the bench. "I know what your sisters have done. The question now is whether you are their accomplice, or their next victim." Margaret's response was instantaneous, a visceral collapse into the nearest chair. Color fled from her face, and her hands shook as they rose to cover her mouth. For long moments she said nothing, her eyes fixed on her husband, an expression there that seemed part terror, part relief, part something unnameable, perhaps gratitude. "I've been waiting for someone to figure it out," she whispered at last. "I've been praying that someone would stop them before they make me do what they did." What followed was a confession that would forever stain the history of Lancaster County. Margaret revealed a truth darker than rumor. The scheme had been Bridget's design, born in the candlelit hours after their father's funeral, forged in whispered resolve. Bridget had calculated that 4 strategic marriages, each followed by a convenient death, would do more than preserve the Brennan inheritance. It would build a dynasty, an empire, enough wealth and influence to sustain them in luxury for the rest of their lives. "We had to think like men," Margaret admitted, her voice trembling yet steady, as though recounting a truth that had been written long before she spoke it. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she spoke, each word sharpened with conviction, tinged with an unsettling resolve. "Men use violence and politics to get what they want," she said, her tone deliberate, almost ceremonial. "But women must be smarter, more patient." Her gaze held the weight of something older, darker. "If we did it right, no one would ever suspect us, because people see what they expect to see. Grieving widows, not calculating killers." The confession that followed peeled away the veil of innocence to reveal the cold, surgical efficiency of the Brennan sisters' design. Every death had been plotted months in advance, executed with exacting precision, layered with contingencies, each framed to appear a tragic accident. Bridget had observed Thomas Hennessy's habits with the patience of a scholar of human behavior, studying his daily routes to Lancaster town, noting the temperament of his horse, memorizing the weather patterns that might conceal their deed. On that fateful morning she drugged his coffee, a calculated move, Margaret disclosed, that would render him dizzy and disoriented but leave no trace detectable once his body was examined. Then came the cruel orchestration of fate itself. She startled his horse at the precise moment he rounded the steepest bend in the road, hurling a stone so that terror and misfortune would meet in perfect collision. Hamilton Crawford's death demanded an even deeper choreography. Catherine had devoted weeks to charting the treacherous ice of Mill Creek, mapping the hidden weaknesses caused by underground springs. On the morning of his demise, she had employed heated iron rods to further weaken the ice, crafting a trap that would appear entirely natural. She walked with him that morning, Margaret continued, tears streaming freely now, insisting on accompanying him to inspect the property boundaries, something she had never done before. With purposeful steps, she guided him to the exact spot where the ice would betray him, and then she stepped away. The ice gave way. Margaret admitted later, in tones as cold as the water, that she had held Crawford's head beneath the surface for nearly a minute. The frigid current had rendered him weak. He could not struggle. But Margaret's confession grew darker still when she spoke of her own part in the conspiracy. She was no innocent bystander swept up in her sister's machinations. She had been, from the start, a reluctant accomplice. Bridget and Catherine made it clear, she said, voice trembling yet resolute, that my cooperation was not optional. They told me the survival of our family depended on all four sisters playing their parts. They warned me, if I refused, they would make it seem I had been the killer all along. Bridget had told her plainly, Margaret said, that evidence could be planted to suggest she had murdered Thomas and Hamilton out of jealousy or greed. They said no one would believe three sisters could work together so efficiently, Margaret confessed, but everyone would believe that one sister had gone mad with jealousy. Judge Whitman listened in mounting horror, not only at the crime she described, but at the dawning realization that his own fate had already been sealed with the same ruthless precision. Margaret revealed the truth he could hardly bear to hear. His murder had been scheduled for November the 15th, 1839, less than 3 weeks away. The method was poison, a slow-acting toxin crafted to mimic a natural heart attack, a plausible death for a man of his age and position. Sarah has been practicing, Margaret said in a whisper, testing doses on stray cats and dogs, finding the right amount that would kill quietly but slowly enough to seem natural. Bridget had declared, "Your death had to be perfect, because you are too prominent for people to accept another convenient accident." And then came the final revelation, the most insidious of all. Whitman's investigation had uncovered another player in this web of calculated murder. Daniel Murphy, the private investigator who had been asking questions around Lancaster County, had not been an outsider, as he claimed. Margaret confessed that Murphy had been theirs all along, a tool hired by the Brennan sisters themselves. A sentinel placed to root out anyone venturing too close to the terrible truth of their conspiracy. Margaret's voice lowered, trembling yet edged with resolve, as she revealed the unseen machinery behind the sisters' scheme. "Bridget wanted to know if anyone suspected us," she said, as if confessing a truth too terrible to be spoken aloud. "We had to stay ahead of any investigation. We had to know what people were whispering, what they were thinking." Her words carried the weight of a clandestine council meeting, a confession of conspiracy so deliberate it seemed rehearsed. Daniel Murphy, she disclosed, was the Brennan sisters' unseen sentinel, their eyes and ears in Lancaster County. "Murphy reports back to her every week," she explained. "He brings names, questions, rumors, anyone asking after us, after the family." The implication struck Judge Whitman with cold clarity. His own investigation, the inquiries he had pursued in silence, the doubts he had harbored, were no longer hidden. They had been reported. The confrontation he now faced with Margaret was not merely a test of truth, but perhaps a calculated moment in the sisters' own design. Was her confession genuine, or was it yet another layer in a labyrinth of deception, a trap to make him lower his guard at precisely the wrong hour? "How do I know you're telling the truth now?" Whitman demanded, the steel of suspicion sharpening his voice. "How do I know this isn't just another veil of lies?" Margaret's reply was deliberate, almost ceremonial. She rose, her movement slow and purposeful, crossing the dim parlor toward the desk. With fingers that trembled not from fear, but from the gravity of her confession, she opened a locked drawer with a small key that hung from her neck. From it, she withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover worn, its edges frayed. "This contains everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing with finality. Placing the book into his hands, she continued. "Every detail of every murder, every plan, every conversation. I have been documenting it all since Thomas's death, knowing that one day I might need proof of what truly happened." As Whitman's fingers brushed the leather, the distant sound of horses' hooves shattered the heavy silence. Catherine and Sarah returning from town, their arrival heralding a new danger. Margaret's eyes locked with her husband's, her expression a mixture of desperation and warning. "They can't know that I've told you," she murmured, her words trembling. "If they suspect you know the truth, they'll kill you tonight." The journal she placed in his hands was more than a book. It was a confession carved in ink and secrecy, a 3-year testament that transformed the Brennan sisters from suspects into architects of cold-blooded murder. Margaret's careful script chronicled not only the deaths of Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford, but the meticulous orchestration that had preceded them and the ruthless calculation that followed. Its first entry, dated November the 15th, 1836, exactly 1 month after Patrick Brennan's funeral, marked the moment grief was transmuted into something darker. "Bridget has presented us with a choice that isn't really a choice at all," Margaret wrote. "We can watch father's legacy be destroyed by inheritance laws, scattered to creditors and tax collectors until nothing remains of 37 years of labor, or we can seize control of our own destiny." Her entry revealed Bridget's chilling doctrine that marriage could be wielded as a weapon and widowhood could become a strategy. 4 marriages, 4 deaths, 4 fortunes. By the end, they would own half of Lancaster County. Subsequent entries traced the sisters' transformation from mourning daughters into calculating predators. They became strategists, methodically evaluating each man's wealth, influence, habits, vulnerabilities. Thomas Hennessy had been chosen not merely for his legal skill, but for his loneliness, his desperation for companionship, a vulnerability that would render him pliant to their design. December 3rd, 1836, Bridget's words were written in cold justification. "We must never allow ourselves to feel guilty about what we are planning. These men will die happy, believing themselves loved and cherished. Their deaths will be quick and relatively painless, far more merciful than the slow starvation that awaits us if we lose the farm." She had declared with chilling clarity, "We are not murderers. We are survivors, wielding the only weapons available to women in a world designed to destroy us." But the journal also revealed the creeping cost of their conspiracy. Margaret's entries grew darker, more fragmented, as if the very act of chronicling their crimes was pulling her deeper into the abyss they had forged. As the pages turned, the journal's cold testimony revealed a descent from whispered theory into calculated execution, a metamorphosis that transformed sibling loyalty into a merciless creed. March the 16th, 1838. Thomas Hennessy lay dead, and Bridget Brennan displayed the stillness of a predator who had fed. She spoke not of grief, but of a grim satisfaction, confessing that the greatest trial had been the performance of mourning, not the act of murder itself. "It was not guilt I wrestled with," she wrote, "but pride that every detail, every measure was exact." Margaret recorded her thoughts with tremors of fear, noting, "I think my sister has crossed into madness beat, but her will is iron, and I am too fearful to stand in her way." Within those entries, a disturbing architecture of roles emerged, each sister's nature twisted into a weapon of deliberate design. Bridget stood as the cold architect, her mind a workshop of strategy, her heart a crucible of ruthlessness, her intellect devoted to the orchestration of slaughter. Catherine was the artisan of manipulation, a surgeon of the soul who could map the weaknesses of men and exploit them with surgical precision. Sarah, with her youthful voice and disarming charm, became both the shadow that gathered intelligence and the hand that delivered death unseen, administering poison as though offering comfort. Margaret, by her own pen, cast herself as the reluctant conspirator, the sister whose evident anguish offered the perfect veil, the alibi of innocence that lent the scheme a cloak of credibility. Her distress became their shield, convincing all observers that at least one of the Brennan sisters was untouched by guilt. July 20th, 1839. Margaret noted in trembling ink that Judge Whitman's suspicions deepened daily. "Cornelius questions everything," she wrote, "about Thomas, about Hamilton, and I cannot answer without unveiling our truth." Bridget's response, penned beside it, was cold and certain. This was always the design. Margaret's marriage to a judge will force us to tread with caution, but it grants us the armor of protection. Who would believe a wife confessing murder, and who would believe a judge deceived by his own bride? As Whitman's eyes scanned these confessions, the sound of horses echoed from beyond the windows, their hooves beating a cruel reminder that his time to decide was vanishing. Outside, Margaret's voice rang out in casual cheer, greeting the returning sisters, and with it vanished the fragile moment of revelation. Yet the journal held a final horror, a true earth darker than the 3 deaths already confessed. The conspiracy was not an end, but a blueprint for perpetuation. Bridget had envisioned a war without end, a campaign to expand their dominion. October 25th, 1839. I have spoken with Murphy, she wrote, about extending our work into neighboring counties. We could forge a sisterhood of widows, a network bound by blood and purpose, systematically removing wealthy men to seize their fortunes. Marriage and death wielded as weapons against male dominion. The final pages, however, carried a message that chilled the marrow. Not only did they hold the proof of all past crimes, but also the clockwork of Whitman's own fate. Margaret's hand trembled as she wrote of the date, November 15th, set for his end. Sarah, she revealed, had refined the poison, a slow-acting extract of foxglove designed to masquerade as a natural collapse of the heart. November the 1st, 1839. 3 drops will suffice, Margaret recorded, to summon chest pains and breathless dread within an hour, and within 4 hours the heart will falter. The act will be seamless, a death disguised as nature's final claim. And there, in that journal, lay the most damning truth of all, a sisterhood bound by blood and conspiracy that had plotted not just death, but the perfection of it. Failure was not an option, for the toxin they planned was both a weapon and a promise. Margaret's journal revealed in cold clinical detail that the foxglove extract, perfected by Sarah's unrelenting experiments, would leave no trace within 24 hours. It was a poison designed not only to kill, but to erase itself, to vanish as though the death had been nothing more than the cruel hand of fate. Bridget's voice, recorded with chilling precision, echoed from the pages. My performance as the grieving widow will be crucial. I must appear devastated, but not surprised, for who would question sorrow born of the burdens of Cornelius's judicial duties? Outside, the voices of Catherine and Sarah grew near, carried on the damp evening air like the soft footfalls of fate itself. In that moment, Judge Whitman made a choice that would mark the turning point of his life, and perhaps his doom. He closed the leather-bound journal with deliberate force, meeting Margaret's wide, terrified eyes, and spoke with a gravity that seemed to still the very air between them. Tomorrow morning, I ride to Philadelphia. I will meet with federal investigators. You are coming with me, and you will tell them everything you have confessed to me tonight. Margaret's breath came in a tremor, her lips parting in a whisper that trembled with both despair and resolve. They'll kill us both before we cross the county line. Bridget has prepared for this from the day it began. There are eyes on every road, favors owed, accidents arranged. Escape is never an option. The front door opened then, a cheerful creak that shattered the tension, and Catherine and Sarah entered. Voices light, laughter ringing like a siren's call, as if oblivious to the darkness that hung in the air. Margaret, with practiced urgency, concealed the journal beneath her shawl. Whitman arranged his face into a mask of ease, though his mind was a storm of suspicion. Cornelius, Margaret. Catherine's voice rang out smooth and bright, her footsteps drawing nearer, carrying with them the cadence of charm and malice. You'll never guess what we discovered in town. Her words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in pleasantry. Sarah's laughter followed, light and musical, but underneath it lay something colder, a shared secret. Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods store has been spreading the most interesting rumors about our family's extraordinary luck with marriage, she said, her tone suggestive. Perhaps we Brennan women possess some sort of supernatural charm over men. The words lingered, insidious. If only she knew the truth. Whitman thought that their charm was forged in calculated bloodshed, and the laughter was a veil over murder. A chill crept through Whitman's veins, the weight of their casual cruelty settling over him. To them, murder was no crime. It was an art, a devotion, a service rendered to their chosen men. Margaret's hand found his beneath the table, trembling. Whether in genuine fear or in practiced deceit, he could not tell. "What did you tell Mrs. Henderson?" she asked, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Catherine stood in the doorway then, her smile both radiant and predatory, as if savoring the knowledge of her power. "I told her," she said, her voice rich with conviction, "that the Brennan women have always understood the importance of caring for the men we love. We ensure they want for nothing, that they never bear the burden of age or misery. We give them peace, even if that peace must be taken by our hand." The implications settled over the parlor like a frost. They did not see murder as sin, but as mercy, a final gift of preservation. It was rationalized in a way that revealed the architecture of their madness. Sarah entered then, carrying a tea service with delicate grace, the movement of her hands practiced, domestic, almost ritualistic. "I thought we might enjoy some refreshment while we discuss the wonderful news Catherine and I heard in town," she said, her tone sweet but edged with an unspoken danger. "Judge Whitman, this will interest you, given your responsibilities." Her emphasis on his title was not courtesy. It was mockery, a deliberate reminder that they knew how far he had come in his inquiries. Whitman's mind sharpened. Daniel Murphy, the private investigator, was not an impartial seeker of truth. He was an instrument of the sisters' control, reporting each question, each suspicion, each step of Whitman's investigation back to Bridget and her co-conspirators. And now, in this room, in this moment, he knew the truth had come home. "What news would that be?" he asked quietly, taking the cup of tea Catherine offered. His voice carried the weight of suspicion and defiance, and in his mind surged the chilling calculation. Was the tea already poisoned with foxglove? Catherine sank into her chosen chair with the ease of a predator returning to its lair, the same worn seat where 6 months earlier she had orchestrated with chilling precision the downfall of Hamilton Crawford. Her posture was casual, almost serene, but her words carried the weight of an ominous revelation. "It seems certain federal authorities have taken an interest," she said softly, as if savoring the impact. "They are making inquiries into unusual death rates among wealthy men in rural Pennsylvania. Their focus is especially sharp where young widows inherit large fortunes under suspicious circumstances." For Whitman, those words landed with the force of a hammer blow. The implications were brutal and clear. His own painstaking investigation might now be redundant, eclipsed by the reach of official scrutiny. Yet it also meant something more terrifying. The sisters themselves knew they were under investigation, that forces far beyond whispered gossip in taverns and town halls were closing in on them. Sarah's voice, sweet and deliberate, carried the next thread of revelation. "Mrs. Henderson at the dry goods store told me," she said, her tone almost conspiratorial, "that a gentleman from Philadelphia has been asking pointed questions about our family. He wanted to know the circumstances of Thomas's death, Hamilton's death, our financial arrangements, and most curiously, about your marriage to Margaret." Whitman's voice was steady but heavy when he spoke. "Did Mrs. Henderson give him information?" He already feared the answer. "Oh yes," Catherine replied with a cheerful candor that belied its menace. "She told him everything she knew, though of course that includes speculation and rumor woven alongside the facts." Her tone was almost amused, as if she found the whole situation a curious experiment. "But you know how these federal men work, Cornelius. They have their methods for separating truth from gossip, especially when they detect patterns that hint at something darker, something organized." Margaret's hand closed on Whitman's with such force that her grip became an ache in his own. It was a silent warning. The words of her sisters, the calm certainty with which they spoke, carried a truth more damning than any confession. Their time was gone. Federal scrutiny had shifted the calculus. The schedule for Whitman's demise, once set for November 15th, now teetered under the weight of urgency. Bridget's voice rang from the kitchen, sharp and deliberate, calling her sisters to join her in private council. Catherine and Sarah rose, offering polite apologies and practiced smiles before slipping away, leaving Whitman and Margaret alone in the parlor. The quiet between them was heavy with anticipation. "They're going to kill you tonight," Margaret whispered the moment the door closed behind them. Her breath was a mixture of fear and resolve. "The federal investigation has forced their hand. They cannot wait until November 15th if questions are already reaching them. They've moved their timeline." Whitman searched, at her face as if reading a confession, seeking the slightest tremor of deception. Everything in Margaret's manner bespoke terror, but he knew too well how finely the Brennan sisters could weave lies when survival demanded it. Was this another act, another layer in their theater of manipulation? "How do I know you're not part of this final performance?" he asked quietly, voice low, sharp with suspicion. "How do I know your confession, your terror, your journal aren't yet another calculated step to lower my guard?" Margaret did not hesitate. She moved with deliberate slowness, reaching beneath her shawl. From hidden folds, she withdrew a small glass vial, its contents clear as distilled water. "This is the foxglove extract Sarah has been preparing," she said, her voice steady now, edged with urgency. "Tonight I was meant to slip 3 drops into your evening brandy, to watch you collapse, and then summon Dr. Mallister to confirm a death from heart failure." Her fingers placed the vial squarely in Whitman's palm, never once breaking eye contact. "If I were still part of their design, I would not have given this to you. The fact that I am handing it to you instead proves where my loyalties truly lie." From the kitchen came the sound of conversation, low, urgent, impossible to decipher, carrying to them like a faint but growing threat. Outside the parlor, shadows lengthened, and the air seemed to hum with the inevitability of the moment. Somewhere beyond the threshold of that quiet room, the Brennan sisters were plotting, and Judge Whitman stood at the precipice of a truth that could destroy them all. The voices from the kitchen had grown urgent, threaded with purpose, a low chorus of plotting that cut through the tense stillness of the parlor. Whitman felt the weight of it settle like a stone in his chest. The 3 sisters were in the midst of urgent planning, and he knew, with the clarity of a man staring into the heart of a storm, that he and Margaret had only minutes to decide their fate before the final phase of the conspiracy was set into motion. "There is something else," Margaret breathed, her words scarcely more than a tremor against the hush. Her voice carried the gravity of a confession she had borne too long. "The journal I showed you is not the whole truth. Bridget has kept something far more damning. Meticulous financial records of every stolen asset, every property transaction, every manipulated inheritance. She calls it insurance, proof of our worth to allies, and leverage for blackmail against anyone who dares threaten us." Whitman's gaze sharpened. "Where are these records?" he asked. Margaret's hand tightened around his own. "In Father's old desk, hidden in the cellar, behind a false panel only Bridget knows how to open. But I have watched her. I have learned her secrets. I have prepared for this moment. The moment when I would have to choose between my sisters and my soul." From the kitchen came the murmur of voices rising, Catherine's tone brisk and Catherine's and Sarah's movements audible now in the sudden clatter of preparation. Then Bridget's voice, sharp, commanding and final, issued orders that made the hairs on Whitman's neck stand. Whatever they were planning, it was about to begin. Whitman exhaled, decision crystallizing in the cold air. "We leave now." His voice was steel. "Through the back door. Take my horse, ride for Lancaster town, and go straight to the federal authorities. Let them explain why their co-conspirator and their 4th victim vanished in the dead of night." But before they could move, Sarah's voice rang out from the kitchen, sweetness sharpened by intent. "Margaret, dear, could you and Cornelius join us for a moment? Bridget has something important she wishes to discuss with both of you." The words were no invitation, they were a summons, and both knew refusal would be tantamount to declaring that their private conversation had unmasked the conspiracy. Margaret turned to her husband, her expression a collision of love, terror, and desperate hope. "If we walk into that kitchen," she whispered, "we may never walk out alive." For 27 years, Judge Cornelius Whitman had made decisions that shaped lives, decisions weighed in the balance of law and justice, but none had carried the burden of what confronted him on that night, November 1st, 1839. Before him lay a choice as stark as any in history: to walk into the kitchen where 3 murderesses waited with their final perfected trap, or to attempt, Escape, a gamble that might save him, but allow the Brennan sisters to carry their dark designs into other counties, other states, wherever ambition and murder beckoned. Before he could speak, the decision was seized from him. From beyond the farmhouse, a sound rose. The pounding of hooves, urgent and relentless. Through the parlor window he saw them, torches flickering in the darkness, riders too numerous for courtesy, too purposeful for parley. Someone was coming to the Brennan farm with authority, and they brought force enough to crush resistance. "Federal marshals," Margaret breathed, her voice tight with dread, eyes fixed on the approaching lights. "They're here." From the kitchen came the sound of sudden commotion, chairs scraping against floors, cabinet doors slamming shut, voices lowered to urgent whispers. The Brennan sisters had seen the riders too. They were enacting the emergency plan they had devised for this exact moment. Bridget appeared in the doorway of the parlor, her composure replaced by the steely control of a general directing her last battle. "Cornelius, Margaret, we must decide our story before those men cross the threshold. There are truths that will serve us all, and truths that will destroy us. Even now, in the shadow of arrest, we must control the narrative." And in her voice, cold, precise, unyielding, lay the final act of the Brennan sisters' dreadful theater. Whitman felt the steel of inevitability press against his chest, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He saw now with perfect clarity that this woman, Margaret, would weave her web of manipulation to the very last breath, turning every moment to her advantage until the noose was drawn tight around her neck. "I think not," he said, rising with a gravity that filled the parlor, stepping between her and the woman who had been both sister and architect of ruin. "Margaret and I will take the truth to the authorities. We will tell them everything. And you, Bridget, will answer for what you have done." At once, Bridget's mask of composed calculation shattered, replaced by a flash of unrestrained fury, the first glimpse of the monster she had concealed behind years of deliberate performance. Her voice was cold and cutting. "You sanctimonious fool, do you imagine your precious law will shield you from us? Do you believe the federal marshals will care for the deaths of a handful of men when fortunes, power, and reputations hang in the balance?" "What do you mean?" Whitman demanded, though a part of him already knew the answer. From the shadow beside her eldest sister stepped Sarah, her sweet, girlish face twisted now into something venomous and vindictive. "Did you truly believe we acted without protection, without allies in the corridors of power? Do you think 4 women could execute perfect murders for 3 years without someone in authority turning their head?" Her words fell like stones. The implication was staggering, a truth darker than any confession. The Brennan sisters' conspiracy was shielded by corruption that reached far beyond the narrow borders of Lancaster County. Somewhere in the highest reaches of influence, someone had been guarding them, perhaps in return for gold stolen, perhaps for debts yet unpaid. Catherine moved to join her sisters in the doorway, her presence a living barricade that cut off all escape. "Judge Whitman," she said softly, but with the chill of inevitability, "you are about to understand that justice is not blind. Justice is bought. Justice is expensive. The men who ride toward this house are not here for us. They are here for you." Before Whitman could speak, the sound of heavy boots against the front porch echoed through the tense stillness. A fist struck the door with authority, sharp and unyielding, followed by a voice that carried an iron weight. "Federal marshals, open this door immediately." Bridget's hands moved with practiced grace to smooth her dress, her face arranged in an artful mask of feminine distress. Her words, spoken softly but with lethal precision, were a final instruction to Whitman. "Remember, Cornelius, you are the one with access to legal documents, with the knowledge to alter inheritance papers, with the connections to arrange convenient accidents. Margaret is the trembling victim, the one who has finally found courage to speak, and you will be her villain." The door swung open before any could reply, and 6 armed men entered. Their presence filled the room like a sudden storm. Weapons were drawn, badges glinted in the dim light. Their leader, a grizzled figure with eyes sharpened by decades of duty, swept the room with the scrutiny of a predator. "I am Marshal William Davies, United States Federal Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania," he declared, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. "Judge Cornelius Wittmann, you stand under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and corruption in office." The words struck Wittmann as though they were blows to his very soul. The sisters had turned his own investigation into a noose, framing him for their crimes, weaponizing his honor against him, transforming his position of trust into proof of guilt rather than innocence. Margaret stepped forward, tears carving channels through her pale cheeks, her voice breaking with the weight of anguish. "Marshal Davies, you do not understand. My husband is innocent. My sisters are the ones who killed Thomas Hennessy and Hamilton Crawford. I have proof, evidence that will show you the truth." But Bridget was ready. Her voice, smooth and controlled, carried the precise inflection of mourning and concern, as though rehearsed for this moment. A chilling performance designed to sway by both law and conscience. "I'm afraid my sister has been under tremendous strain since her marriage." Margaret's voice trembled, brittle as glass, yet weighted with conviction. "She's been making wild accusations, spinning elaborate fantasies of murder conspiracies. Dr. Mallister can confirm. I've seen him myself. She has been exhibiting unmistakable signs of severe mental disturbance." Marshal William Davies regarded the four figures in the parlor with a deliberate intensity, his gaze the practiced scrutiny of a man who had walked the corridors of human deceit and recognized every mask of falsehood. "Mrs. Wittmann," he said, his voice carrying the grave authority of a tribunal, "we have obtained detailed testimony from a private investigator named Daniel Murphy. He claims to hold irrefutable evidence that you and your sisters orchestrated the systematic murder of your husbands for financial gain." The words descended upon the room like a stone cast into still water, shattering its fragile calm. Margaret's pale face brightened for an instant with desperate hope, while her sisters exchanged sharp glances, their composure fraying under the weight of accusation. Catherine's voice was quick, defensive, a fragile dam of denial. "Murphy has been working for us. We engaged him to investigate suspicious deaths in Lancaster County because we feared for our safety. If he now makes accusations, it is clear he has been corrupted, manipulated by those with an interest in destroying our family." But Marshal Davies pressed forward, his tone relentless, each word chiseling away at the veneer of their defense. "Mr. Murphy has supplied us with extensive financial records that expose the systematic theft of property and assets following each death. He has presented physical evidence, poison vials, forged documents, and correspondence that traces the entire conspiracy in painstaking detail." The room shifted. Sarah's sweetness, cultivated like a weapon, cracked and fell away. Beneath it lay the cold precision of the killer revealed. "Murphy was meant to destroy that evidence," she admitted, her voice dropping to something sharper, darker. "He swore it would all be gone, if we paid him enough." Her confession lingered in the air like a death sentence, corroborating every truth Margaret had documented in her journal and every suspicion Wittmann had silently carried that night. Bridget's eyes narrowed into a blade of hatred as they locked on Sarah, an unspoken acknowledgement that her youngest sister's admission had undone them all. Marshal Davies continued with inexorable force. "We also have sworn testimony from Judge Wittmann himself, transmitted through intermediaries over the past several weeks, detailing his discovery of the conspiracy and his efforts to gather evidence against its perpetrators." Wittmann's face betrayed confusion. He had given no testimony. He had contacted no investigators. His knowledge of the conspiracy had crystallized only hours before. Then comprehension struck like lightning. Margaret had been working in secrecy, communicating with federal investigators, aiding Murphy's probe for weeks. She had been orchestrating her own act of justice. The leather-bound journal she withdrew from beneath her shawl was her offering to truth. "Everything is here," she whispered. "Every murder, every plan, every conversation. I have been gathering evidence since Thomas Hennessy's death, awaiting the moment to deliver justice for the men my sisters killed." As shackles were fastened upon the wrists of the Brennan sisters, Bridget spoke with cold clarity, her voice a testament to their madness. "We saved those men. We freed them from the slow decay of age, the burden of watching their fortunes collapse, the helplessness of their bodies failing. We gave the soul love, comfort, and dignity right to the moment of their deaths. We were merciful killers. History will remember us as women who refused to be victims of a system built to destroy us." And as the sisters, three embodiments of calculated horror, were led away to stand trial in Philadelphia, Judge Whitman understood the enormity of what had just been revealed. Margaret's courage had spared his life, but it had also shattered a far larger darkness. The Brennan sisters' ambition had extended far beyond Lancaster County. They had planned a network of widows, a hidden empire of death, a scheme that could have spread across the state, and perhaps beyond, unless it was stopped that night. The years that followed carried the weight of a trial unlike any Pennsylvania had ever seen. The courtroom became a theater of shock, horror, and fascination. The Brennan sisters, brought to account for crimes that had haunted Lancaster County for decades. Bridget, Catherine, and Sarah Brennan were convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, their names forever etched in infamy as the first women in the state to be sentenced to death for such calculated atrocities. On March 15, 1841, exactly 3 years to the day after Thomas Hennessy's murder, the sisters were led to the gallows together, bound in a grim testament to their unity and the depths of their depravity. Margaret Brennan Whitman, by contrast, walked free. Granted immunity in exchange for her damning testimony, she and her husband vanished from Pennsylvania, retreating under assumed names to Ohio, carrying with them the burden of survival and secrecy. The Brennan farm, that sinister stage for their conspiracy, was sold to satisfy restitution owed to the victims' families. The once imposing stone house, a house steeped in whispers and blood, was torn down, leaving only the faintest echo of what had transpired within its walls. Yet the story of the Brennan sisters did not end there. Decades later, historians and researchers uncovered chilling records that revealed the conspiracy's reach far beyond Lancaster County. In Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware during the same period, similar patterns emerged, suspicious deaths of young widows who inherited vast fortunes under mysterious circumstances. It became clear the Brennan sisters had sown a blueprint, and others had taken up their method, adopting the grim formula of marriage and murder. The case set legal precedent, reshaping how organized crime involving family members would be investigated. It exposed the unsettling truth that evil could flourish in plain sight, hidden behind facades of respectability and the veneer of feminine virtue. It challenged assumptions, forcing society to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that calculated violence could dwell where least expected. The legacy of the Brennan sisters endures, etched into law, whispered in local legend, and preserved in the warnings of history. Their tale became a cautionary testament that the darkest crimes are those wrapped in familiarity, cloaked in trust, and carried out under the guise of tradition. Today, where the Brennan farm once stood, a shopping center rises, and few in Lancaster County know the blood-stained history buried beneath its foundations. Yet, in hushed conversations among local historians, the names of those four sisters linger, a warning etched into the soul of the county. This is a story that forces us to ask, how many other conspiracies have lain hidden, shielded by the unwillingness to believe that such calculated cruelty could come from women? How many victims might still be buried in silence? The Brennan sisters succeeded for years precisely because no one dared imagine four women capable of such relentless, systematic brutality. If this chilling story has gripped you, share this documentary with someone who hungers for dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, subscribe to walk with us deeper into history's shadows, and leave your thoughts below. Do you believe the full truth has been revealed, or that there are other victims we may never know? Could such conspiracies still operate today, hidden behind facades of respectability and devotion? The Brennan sisters' story remains a testament to the fact that evil does not always wear a mask of malice. Sometimes it wears the face of an angel. History holds its secrets close, but here we dare to unearth them, and so the question lingers. Will the darkness ever truly be exposed? See you in the next chapter of our journey into the forgotten horrors of the past.